Hello, Mr. Usher here. I got kind of a special video for you guys. This one's going to be talking about different treatments for anxiety disorders. Very basically, I'm going to go over things in 4 steps here. So I'm going to go over psychodynamic treatments, one of the psychotherapy kinds we went through before, humanistic existentialist treatments. I'm going to go over cognitive behavioral treatments, and I'm going to talk about anxiolytics, which are basically medications used to treat anxiety. So those are the 4 we're going to go over. I'm going to try to make it pretty concise here. Very basically, what we're doing here is we're going to talk about first psychodynamic treatments for anxiety disorders. So for example, we could deal with PTSD, right? We could talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. If you guys remember, post-traumatic stress disorder requires some kind of traumatic experience to occur. Let's say it's a childhood sexual abuse, just as an example. Horrible thing, obviously, but an example here that we can use. So we have that going on, and classically we might have this, lying on the couch method here. Lie on the couch, talk about my feelings, my relationship with my parents, maybe I talk about my dreams, somebody shows me pictures, I think about, what the picture makes me think of, I do word association. So that's where a lot of this stuff comes from, right? That's kind of the history of it, into Sigmund Freud and all that kind of stuff. But of course nowadays we do more of a modern or psychodynamic approach, right? But there's still some similar elements here. We're going to try to look at, so what actually happened in your early upbringing? Did it relate to the trauma at all? Maybe there was abuse with a parent or with somebody very close to the parent. We're going to try to look at, what kinds of memories do you maybe have kind of buried down, kind of suppressed to some extent that we can maybe tease out, things that you're maybe ignoring that you shouldn't be ignoring if you want to really treat the anxiety. And then, of course, the therapist is going to try to read into some of the comments you make, even kind of the subtler comments that, really don't necessarily have any clear meaning, but from the therapist's point of view, have some kind of deeper, unconscious meaning, right? Anyway, that's basically the psychodynamic approach. Kind of assumes there's something secret that needs to be teased out, right? And that your anxiety is really coming from the fact that, you are kind of not dealing with an issue that's buried somewhere deep in your subconscious. And if you dealt with that issue that the therapist is kind of uniquely equipped to help you reveal, well, then maybe your anxiety can be cured, right? So that's one approach. Another approach would be humanistic existentialist therapy, right? So for this, I thought we'd look at a different disorder, in this case, generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, if you want. So with generalized anxiety disorder, of course, it's kind of just like the name sounds. It's general, right? The person kind of often has a unspecified fear of something that maybe is going to happen at some point in the future. They can't really pin it down, right? But it's very strong, it's very intense, it's very debilitating, right? It distresses them. It makes them appear deviant in public. It causes dysfunction. Probably won't be that dangerous, but it could be if it gets really extreme. Anyway, so if we're looking at a humanistic existentialist approach, right, we might have something a little bit more personal in nature. So, you might take some chairs here. Be a little bit more personal in nature. Maybe I'd sit down with the client and I would say, all right, so tell me about what's troubling you. Give me your perspective here. And so they would talk about how I'm feeling anxious about this, I'm feeling anxious about that, I'm worried this is going to happen, I'm worried, this person is thinking these things about me, just letting all these things fly out in the air, right? And initially, I would listen, and I would nod, and I would validate what they're saying, often using, of course, what we call unconditional positive regard, right? So if they say, well, I'm worried that my coworker, who I barely talk to, right, is secretly plotting to get me fired and ruin my life, right? And so that might sound kind of out there to me, right, as a therapist, but I don't say that to the patient. Instead, I'm like, well, I'm hearing that you're feeling a tremendous amount of anxiety about this coworker, and that you're really worrying about practical things in your life that you want to keep safe. And this would be terrifying to anybody in that situation. You would be really concerned that, something is going to really upset your life. And that would be totally normal for anybody in your situation. So you're giving that unconditional positive regard to the other person. So basically they get the sense that they're validated and that their fears and their insecurities are not alien or abnormal, they're appropriate for the situation. So that's kind of where you get started. Then, of course, you kind of want to deal with something deeper. You take kind of more of an existential or philosophic approach. We would understand the fact that anxiety is a fundamental part of being a human, right? We're conscious, we have this prefrontal cortex with all these executive functions here, right, that allow us to think about all kinds of different things in the world, including things that may or may not happen, right? And anxiety, right, as opposed to fear, is generally about things that may or may not happen, right? And so what the therapist might do is point out that part of being human is being anxious, right? And so they might kind of point out eventually after a number of sessions with the individual that, look, you deal with a lot of anxiety and that's tough, but it's also part of being human. And you're not a bad person for feeling anxious. You are a human. You're a human being, and anxiety is part of being a human being. So, instead of just kind of focusing on getting rid of that anxiety or trying to pretend the anxiety doesn't exist, how can we cope with it, right? How can we maybe meditate more, maybe spend more time with our friends and discuss our anxieties with them? How can we maybe try to understand the things that cause us anxiety more, or address the people that causes anxiety more directly? That kind of thing, right? So it's really more about living with the anxiety and not getting rid of it. That would be more of a humanistic existentialist approach, right? Reorienting here. So, if you were to take a third approach, a cognitive behavioral approach, which is kind of more of a scientific thing, right? We might have something where we're kind of looking at the relationship between different thoughts and feelings and beliefs, right? That's kind of the core of cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's say we're looking at a phobia, like thalassophobia, which is a fear of snakes, right? Many people are afraid of snakes, right? So basically, you might have different thoughts over here, right? You might have feelings over here. And, these things kind of rebound off of each other, right? So there's a relationship here between the two of them. And what the therapist would try to do is try to examine these relationships. And particular, they would want to examine the relationships between those two and the behaviors that people have, right? That's the behavioral component of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So they want to examine those relationships because there are the relationships between really all three of these, right? Thoughts and feelings, feelings and behaviors and thoughts, right, is the triangle, right? And they'd want to try to examine, is this relationship rational, right? Does it make sense that you avoid going by this river because you're afraid of snakes? Are there actually snakes there? If there are not snakes there, why do you avoid going there, right? You think about snakes, or you think about something wiggly and you get afraid, right? Maybe it makes sense to think about snakes and get afraid, but does it make sense to think about something wiggly and get afraid? Somebody has a gummy worm, and, that makes you feel afraid. Is that rational? Does that fear fit the facts, right? So all these kinds of re-examinations of different thoughts and feelings and so on, they can kind of help a person from a cognitive perspective. But then there's the behavioral perspective, which probably would involve exposure therapy, right? So the person who's afraid of snakes, that's a reality. That fear is intense and irrational, because that's what a phobia is. A phobia is intense and irrational. So what do we do with that, right? Well, we want to expose them very gradually to the element they're afraid of. Maybe initially we show them, some squiggly lines on a paper. The fear is really, really, really intense, just to get them used to the squiggliness. Later we want to show them some pictures of snakes, maybe illustrated pictures of snakes, then maybe actual live pictures of snakes. After that, maybe moving on to like a video of snakes moving around, maybe even eventually snakes, say, killing and eating prey, because they do that. Then we maybe take them to a reptile house at a zoo. They'd watch snakes behind the glass in person, right? And, ultimately, eventually, we'd probably have them interacting directly with the snake. Once they've gone through all these stages and they've gotten gradually less and less fearful of this item, when they've been desensitized to this item, they would be able to interact directly with the snake, and hopefully that would ultimately get them over the hump of their phobia, to the point where they're, maybe still uncomfortable with snakes. They prefer not to be around snakes, but they no longer have this irrational, intense phobia of snakes that, say, prevents them from doing normal things like walking by a river or moving by, tall grass or something like that, where a snake might be. Anyway, so those are kind of 3 different behavioral approaches. That's parts 1, 2, and 3 here. Fourth part is anxiolytics, or anxiety-reducing medications, right? So there are 2 basic kinds I'm going to talk about. 1 are benzodiazepines, and 2 are SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So, benzodiazepines are basically a kind of sedative, ultimately. There's something that's used not only for anxiety, but to basically calm people or even put them to sleep. One of them might be this one called the Razzipam, better known as Ativan. And these can be used to help a lot of people, particularly with disorders such as panic disorder, which you might have seen from the Ed puzzle yesterday, right? Panic disorder involves frequent panic attacks where your body just kind of goes into extreme high gear. It floors it, so to speak, with your sympathetic nervous system, so that your heartbeat is racing, you're breathing incredibly fast, your muscles are tensing, you might be sweating, all kinds of different symptoms, right? So to treat that in the moment, you might want to use a benzodiazepine like Ativan. But, and this is a big but, there are a lot of side effects with these, and more importantly, they can become addictive very quickly. People can easily become addicted to benzodiazepines, and that can be a problem. So you want to use them with extreme caution. Typically, clinicians and doctors would recommend that you use benzodiazepines to treat some kind of anxiety disorder for no more than 2 to 4 weeks, right? Beyond that, it's not medically safe. It's likely to induce a dependency state. The person can become addicted, and that can become very bad. Maybe a safer option, not as quickly of an option, but a safer option would be an SSRI, such as Prozac. Now, SSRIs are more commonly used to treat depression, and they are very effective for that, at least with moderate to severe depression. But they also have an anxiolytic or anti-anxiety effect. So they could help, long-term at least, with certain anxiety disorders, including panic disorder. It might take a little while longer, but they'll work, right? Of course, there are some side effects too. You could have, say, issues with sleep. You could have issues with constipation. You could have issues with digestion, maybe issues with sexual function. But yeah, they're definitely safer than something like a benzodiazepine, so probably a better thing to go with there. Anyway, so that's the 4 approaches there, 4 different ways to look at treating anxiety disorders, 4 different disorders here that we looked at. Anyway, different questions obviously have been interspersed throughout this video, which I made into an Ed puzzle. Hopefully you answered them all and you were good to the substitute. Anyway, that's it for me for now. I will see you on Monday.